seem to whisper.
Somebody!
Stay nighty-night and kiss me. Just hold me tight and tell me you'll miss me. While I'm alone and blue as can be. Little dream of
The 369th Infantry Regiment, better known as the Harlem Hellfighters, was a mainly all-black American infantry regiment constituted on June 2nd of 1913 in the New York Army National Guard as the 15th New York Infantry Regiment. The unit was officially organized on June 29th of 1916. The 369th fought in World War I as part of the American Expeditionary Force sent to France to aid in the destruction of the German Empire and would actually become known as the first African-American Army regiment to serve with the AEF overseas during the war. Before they left the Western Hemisphere, they were not even allowed to participate in the farewell parade of New York's National Guard, the so-called Rainbow Division. The reason Hayward, the regimental commander, was given was that black is not a color of the rainbow. Now Colonel Hayward, who treated all of his men with respect, pulled every political string he could to assure his men would be rewarded with a victory parade when they came home in February 1919. The Harlem Hellfighters were called into federal service in 1917, and on March 1st of 1918, they were officially renamed the 369th Infantry Regiment. Due to the fact that rumors over 200 for unit designations were usually assigned to men who were drafted, the naming of the 369th Infantry Regiment was seen as an insult to the members, as they had volunteered for service. Initially, the 369th performed grueling labor services such as unloading ships, supplies, and other demoralizing manual labor. This would all soon change, however.
Although the Harlem Hellfighters were given combat training, the racial segregation of the American Army kept them from the front lines of France. Apparently, the white establishment did not believe the African Americans had the intelligence to think clearly. The Harlem Hellfighters were given over to French command in April of 1918, and again, this was seen as a huge disrespect to the African American unit. Pershing had originally stated that no American unit would be fed to the French or British, who desperately needed men to send into the great meat grinders. And the fact that he did just that to the 369th throws up major racial red flags. Nevertheless, the Harlem Hellfighters were determined to show their dedication and courage to the world. The French, specifically the French 161st Infantry Division, took the African American regiment in with respect and treated them fairly, allowing them to fight equally on the front lines as any other man would. The French were amazed at how the men of the 369th ran straight at the enemy without batting an eye, and under Hayward they enjoyed high morale and a desire to gain a reputation. Perhaps the most famous moment of the Harlem Hellfighters' 191 days in action was starred by Henry Johnson and Needham Roberts in a hole in the middle of no man's land.
Henry Johnson is perhaps one of the most remarkable black military heroes in U.S. history.
And he found himself in no man's land with Private Needham Roberts manning a listening post.
And Needham Roberts hears click, click, click. And he realizes somebody's cutting the wire. It's potentially a German raid.
And so Roberts is passing him grenades, and they line up these grenades, and the Germans actually do come across the lines. Roberts is hurt, and now Henry Johnson is left to defend their position and to stave off this attack. And then he makes the mistake of jamming a French cartridge into his American gun, and it no longer will work, and the Germans are on top of it.
He then used his rifle like a club, and then he ended up fighting with a knife against the Kaiser's best and turned them.
He's wounded in the fray. He's struck, for example, in the foot, and has a debilitating injury as a result. And he fights them off, he says, for what seemed like an hour.
The Germans ran shrieking into the night, all because of one man.
It's not until the next morning that people realize what a tremendous act this was. They discover 4 bodies of dead German soldiers, And they also realize from the equipment and other things that are left behind that as many as 30 may have been involved in this altercation.
As soon as he drove off those Germans, the French awarded him with the Croix de Guerre, a great honor. Unfortunately, it took about 75 years for the US government to give him the Legion of Merit. Had he been white, he would have walked out of that war with the Medal of Honor. What was so shocking to me when I began to research the story of the Hellfighters was that after they had performed so magnificently in combat, the United States government actually sent a memorandum to the French government, essentially implementing Jim Crow, essentially saying, don't give them some notion that they are equals, because we don't want them taking that notion back to the United States and demanding equality.
When he come back to the United States, he's not awarded the Purple Heart. There's no notation in his military record of his injury. And so he winds up not being able to work because of this injury. He doesn't get any kind of assistance from the Army or from the government as a result. And he ends up dying in 1929 penniless. So it again shows the paradox. Here's this great story of valor and of courage on the part of this soldier. And ultimately, he comes back to a nation that doesn't honor that sacrifice.
We tend to think we all know American history so well, but the story of the Harlem Hellfighters should be one of the first stories told. It wasn't about killing other people, it was about being Americans and serving their country well. That was the inclination of the Harlem Hellfighters.
When you are African American in 1917, democracy is armor. Democracy is a weapon. And to fight for a war to make the world safe for democracy was something more than just some ethereal crusade for the Hellfighters. It had concrete results. They were fighting for the rights to be a citizen of the country that they were born in.
Two men taking on up to 30 elite German stormtroopers and turning them. That there is simply amazing, and the French knew this with their action of recognizing both men with the highest French military medal, the Croix de Guerre. America, though, took another 70-plus years to recognize Johnson for his heroic actions, and this just shows how while the Harlem Hellfighters were among the greatest units of the Great War, not losing an inch of ground to the enemy and taking no man prisoner, the U.S. still refused to recognize their greatness. The U.S. government not only refused the celebration of African American units, but they also urged the French to enforce Jim Crow laws and racially assault these men who were just trying to fight for their country.
Known by the French as the Men of Bronze, the Harlem Hellfighters fought in the Champagne-Marne and Meuse-Argonne offensives, as well as at famous battles like Belleau Wood and Chateau Thierry. They suffered immense casualties in these engagements, but nevertheless they kept fighting until they were forced to take a step back from the hot front lines and maneuver to a quiet sector in the Vosges Mountains. On November 11th, the day of the armistice, this was where the unit was, and 6 days later they would be the first unit to reach the Rhine. The regiment was relieved on December 12th of 1918 from assignment to the French 161st Division. The unit returned to the New York port of embarkation and was demobilized on February 28, 1919, at Camp Upton at Yemfack, New York, and returned to the New York Army National Guard.
They were welcomed home with a parade in New York City along Fifth Avenue, an honor denied to them before they left for war because of their race, if you remember. But the cheering would soon come to an end. The Harlem Hellfighters, despite their heroic actions and undeniable dedication to their nation in World War I, came home to some of the worst racial violence the nation has ever known as the Red Summer of 1919 tore through the country. Due to large migrations northward by African Americans to fill factory jobs left by soldiers, many cities expressed immense amounts of hate and racism pointed toward the increasing minority. The North was not used to having so many African Americans in their midst, and the competition for jobs and such made many turn to violence.
At the same time, though, the status of the African Americans did improve in the terms of the increase of African American expression in the form of music and the arts. This was seen in the Jazz Age and Harlem Renaissance. Nevertheless, the status of the African American would continue to teeter, with the majority advance coming in the late 1940s with the desegregation of the Army, and in the 1950s and 60s with the revamped civil rights movements.
So while the Harlem Hellfighters and other African American units who served in the First World War did not gain much for their people initially, they were a string to the violin that would eventually play the sweet song of true freedom.
They push, we push. Every once in a while, we push hard enough that the light breaks through the clouds, and a world beyond the war glimmers, just out of reach. The war is the world, and the world is the war. But behind every gun sight is a human being. We are those people. We are the jaded, we are the naive, we are the honorable and the criminal. We are the bound for legend and the lost to history. We are the knights of the sky, the ghosts in the desert, and the rats in the mud. These are our stories.